They don't see you, not really. They speak over you not because they hate you, but because your silence taught them they could. They ask for more than they give, not because they're cruel, but because your kindness offered no resistance. And the most dangerous part, you let them. You kept showing up, kept explaining, kept softening your voice so theirs could be louder. You became safe. You became easy. You became invisible. But you weren't always like this. There was a time you entered rooms without shrinking, when your eyes didn't look for approval before you spoke, when you didn't need to be liked to feel real. And they felt it, even if they didn't say it, even if they didn't respect it. But then the world trained you. Smiles were rewarded. Silence was overlooked. Obedience was praised. And presence became performance. So you learned how to disappear while staying in the room. You learned how to be approachable, pleasant, useful, digestible. You made yourself into a version of yourself that wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. But here's the truth. They never feared you because you never gave them a reason to. Not because you were weak, but because you refused to be unpredictable. The world doesn't fear kindness. It doesn't even fear goodness. It fears mystery. And you were never mysterious. You were available. You were transparent. You were too easy to understand, too quick to comfort, too ready to forgive. And they learned. They learned that you'd always reply, that you'd always explain, that you'd absorb their chaos so they could stay comfortable. You became the sponge for their storms, not because you deserved it, but because you refused to let the storm be seen in you. You weren't soft, you were silent. And that silence was mistaken for surrender. But it wasn't. It was survival. It was observation. It was study. You were never harmless. You were just patient. And that's what they never understood. You weren't trying to be loved. You were trying not to be feared. But now you're not afraid of being feared. You've seen what being liked gets you overlooked, overused, and forgotten. You've lived the cost of being predictable, of being the safe one. And now you've remembered what they never saw coming. Your silence wasn't weakness. It was the edge of something sharper, something colder, something final. Not violence, not cruelty, just the quiet, unwavering presence of someone who doesn't need to speak to be felt. They thought you were quiet, but you were simply watching. And the moment you stop trying to be understood, you become the thing they start trying to figure out. They expect you to flinch. That's how they measure their reach, not by how loud they get, but by how much they can make you shrink. And you used to flinch. You used to rush in with explanations, patch things with apologies, overexpress, to reassure them you meant no harm. You gave them your clarity like a gift. You bled your truth just to prove your innocence. But now you let the silence stretch. Now you let the question hang unanswered. Now you look at them without blinking, not because you're angry, but because you're no longer available. They don't know what version of you they're speaking to anymore. And that alone changes everything. You've become unreadable. Not mysterious in the poetic way, not cool or detached for style, but unreadable like a locked door they no longer have the key for. They don't know if you're amused or done. They don't know if you're watching or judging. They don't know if your stillness is approval or a warning. And that ambiguity, it burns them. Because humans fear the undefined. They fear what they can't shape. They fear silence that doesn't seek comfort. They fear a presence that doesn't perform. You've stopped giving them the cues. You don't nod to make them feel heard. You don't react when they throw bait. You don't defend when they test the edges of your patience. You've become unfamiliar. And unfamiliar makes them nervous, because now they don't know where the line is. And when people don't know where the line is, they step lighter. They watch their tone. They measure their jokes. They hesitate before poking at your calm. Not because you threatened them, but because you didn't. You said nothing and let them hear their own echo instead. They used to see you as safe. Now they see you as uncertain. And uncertainty carries more weight than any threat ever could. You're no longer the one to chase. You're no longer the one to clarify. You're no longer the one to smooth over the tension in the room. Now you are the tension, you. Your stillness doesn't ask for attention. It commands it. Because the one who doesn't speak is the one they look at the longest. The one who doesn't flinch is the one they prepare for. The one who doesn't explain is the one who decides when the silence ends. And in a world that talks too much, the quiet one becomes legend. You didn't leave to punish them. You left because staying started to cost you more than disappearing ever could. And still they felt it. The moment you stopped showing up, the atmosphere shifted. Not with drama, not with blame, just absence. And it wasn't the kind of absence people forget. It was the kind that echoes. The kind that forces reflection. They start wondering what they did wrong. They start replaying the last thing they said. They wonder if they pushed too hard. If maybe this time, you're not coming back. You never raised your voice. You never cursed them out. You never slammed the door. But you disappeared. And that silence was louder than anything you could have screamed. Because silence has a weight. And the ones who once mistook your kindness for endless permission now sit quietly asking themselves why it suddenly feels colder in the room. They begin to realize something they never wanted to admit. You were never the problem. You were the gravity holding it all together. And now that you're gone, they're floating in the mess they created. That's what they never expected. They thought walking away was weakness. They thought silence meant surrender. They thought distance was avoidance. But now they understand. Your absence wasn't a retreat. It was a mirror. And when you held it up, they saw themselves, not you. And it stung. Because in the stillness you left behind, they finally had to sit with the version of themselves they always projected onto you. The manipulator. The overtaker. The one who only noticed your value when you stopped offering it for free. You didn't need revenge. You needed clarity. And you found it not in confrontation, but in walking out quietly, without permission, without a scene. That's the kind of disappearance that rearranges people. Not because you made them feel bad, but because you left no distraction from the truth anymore. They were never entitled to your presence. They were just used to it. And now they've learned that losing you doesn't feel like losing a person. It feels like losing balance. You don't have to make them miss you. You just have to stop showing up. And let them miss the version of themselves that only existed when you were still willing to carry their weight. They started moving differently around you, not because you changed your voice, but because you stopped offering them access. You used to fill every silence. You used to smooth every awkward moment. You used to be the emotional net beneath their chaos. But now, you just let the silence breathe. You let the tension stretch. You let them feel the discomfort they used to throw at you. And what happened? They changed. Not out of love, out of calculation. They watched your face for signals. They rehearsed their words before speaking. They retracted jokes halfway through. Why? Because now you don't flinch. Now you don't chase. Now you don't clarify their misunderstandings just to keep the peace. They don't fear your rage. They fear your neutrality. They fear the way you blink and say nothing. They fear that you might not respond at all. And that fear, it becomes command. Not because you wanted control, but because you mastered restraint. This is where power lives. Not in volume, not in conflict, not in forcing others to obey, but in the pause you don't rush to fill. In the breath you take before replying or choosing not to. You're not cold, you're precise, and they don't know what that precision is capable of. So they retreat. They respect. They recalibrate, not because you asked, but because your energy told them it was time. They begin to speak softer, move slower, measure their presence against yours, because now they're in orbit and you've become the center of gravity. That's what happens when silence matures into presence. You don't command the room adjusts to you. They never heard you roar, but they still remember the silence you left behind, because in that silence they saw who they were and who they weren't ready to become. You didn't intimidate them with threats. You invited them to imagine what would happen if they crossed a line that you never had to draw out loud. And imagination is always more terrifying than reality. You didn't become powerful by chasing power. You became powerful by removing your need to be understood. And when that happened, the game changed. Not just for you, but for everyone watching. You don't stay quiet because you don't know what to say. You stay quiet because they don't deserve to hear it yet. They've mistaken restraint for confusion. But you're not confused. You're calculating. Every silence is intentional. Every glance is measured. Every moment you say nothing is the moment they lean in further, trying to decode what you've already decided. You don't interrupt. You let them speak. You let them overexpose themselves. Because in silence, the loudest ones show their weaknesses. And you take notes. You used to rush in to clarify your position. Now you let ambiguity work for you. They ask what you meant. You shrug. They push for more. You blink. They accuse you of being distant. You smile and let it hang there. You never deny. You never confirm. You just let their imaginations do the damage. Because the truth is, people obsess over what they can't define. They lose sleep over what they can't label. They project, they analyze, they invent stories just to feel like they still have some control over your silence. But they don't. You're not cold. You're controlled. You're not absent. You're selective. Let them wonder what you're thinking. Let them feel the space between your words. Let them rehearse conversations you'll never finish. Because you've learned something most people never do, that power isn't in how loud you are, but in how many people adjust their voice in your presence. You've become a mirror. You don't react, you reflect. You don't perform, you observe. You don't chase, you pause. And the longer the pause, the more uncertain they become. This is no longer silence, it's strategy. A strategy of posture, of tension, of controlled detachment. You give nothing away. You stay present, but unreachable. Kind, but not soft. Still, but not passive. And in a world addicted to explanation, you've become the exception they can't explain away. They call it mystery. But you know what it really is? It's discipline. It's edge. It's what makes them hold their breath when you enter the room and replay everything they said after you leave. You didn't storm out. You simply stopped being reachable. No text, no exit speech, no dramatic gesture. You just vanished. And they felt it. Not all at once, but slowly. Like the temperature dropping in a room, you don't notice it at first. Until your breath fogs, until your hands tremble, until you realize something is missing. That's the weight of your absence. It creeps, it lingers, it rewrites memory. They used to dismiss you, but now they replay every moment you were there. Not because they miss your face, but because they can't replace your silence. You became the empty chair they avoid looking at, the unfinished sentence they can't complete, the question they don't want answered, because deep down they already know. You weren't the problem, you were the balance. And now that you're gone, nothing fits where it used to. They scroll through your old messages like clues. They try to trace back where they went too far. But you never said. You never had to. You left them with their own reflection and the echo of everything they refused to hear when you were still speaking. You became consequence without warning, absence without closure, and that unsettles people more than rage ever could. They don't know how to beg for someone who never demanded to be needed. They don't know how to apologize to someone who already let go. They don't know how to chase someone who left without asking to be followed. Your silence didn't punish them. It exposed them, and that exposure burns. Because now they understand you were never loud, but you were never replaceable. Now, every room without you feels smaller. Every laugh without you feels forced. Every attempt to move on feels staged. They thought they had time. They thought you'd always come back. They thought your patience would last forever. But now they see. You didn't leave because you stopped caring. You left because they stopped noticing. And by the time they did, you had already become someone else. Someone who doesn't return to rooms where their silence was misunderstood. You don't speak to be heard anymore. You speak when the silence has finished doing its job. And often, that moment never comes. You've become someone who doesn't announce their arrival. You enter without needing permission. You leave without leaving a trail. And still they remember you, not because of what you said, but because of what they couldn't forget after you said nothing. You don't look for reactions. You don't seek agreement. You don't offer explanations. Because explanation is currency for those still trying to be understood. You're done trying to be understood because you finally understand yourself. You're not a mystery because you're hiding. You're a mystery because you no longer need to be solved. They don't get access to your thoughts. They get fragments, glances, moments. And those are more than enough to keep them awake at night. They'll ask, was he angry or just done? Was she disappointed or did she stop caring? Will he ever come back? They won't know. And that's the point. Your power was never in the answer. It was in the question that still echoes long after you're gone. They walk differently around you now. Not because you said anything threatening, but because your calm reminds them what real consequence looks like. You don't need to raise your voice. You don't need to issue warnings. You've become a presence that speaks through absence, a standard that doesn't shift a weight that's felt even when you're not in the room. You don't win arguments. You end them with a glance, a silence, a door that doesn't reopen. And now, every time they feel that tension, they remember you didn't bark. You didn't beg. You didn't chase. You just vanished, and in that vanishing, you taught them something they'll never unlearn. That presence is not about being seen. It's about being felt long after they stop looking for you. That's the final power. Not fear, not dominance, but the echo of your restraint, the discipline of your absence, the haunting memory of someone who needed nothing and still changed everything.